I was just a kid. My grandma was sent home in a wheelchair essentially to die. She had end-stage heart disease. Already had so many bypass surgeries, basically ran out of plumbing at some point. Confined to a wheelchair, crushing chest pain. Her life was over at age 65. But then she heard about this guy, Nathan Pritikin, one of our early lifestyle medicine pioneers. They wheeled her in, and she walked out. Though she was given a medical death sentence at age 65, thanks to a healthy diet, was able to enjoy another 31 years.
This is the Home of Healthspan podcast, where we profile health and wellness role models, sharing their stories and the tools, practices, and routines they use to live a lively life. All right, Dr. Greger, so good to see you. Normally, I would have prepped you for a couple minutes before, but we're tight on time and want to jump straight in. So, the first thing I would love to start with is we were recently in Boston together at the WHOOP event or TEDx Boston, all on longevity. And, I was a little fanboying, very excited to meet you. As soon as I see you, I say, oh my God, Dr. Greger, you changed my life. And I think this is so special. And then 10, 15 minutes later, I'm in the hallway and I see another lady runs up like, Dr. Greger, you changed my life. And so my first question is, how often do you get that?
Well, it's a self-selected audience, right? It's a longevity audience. What do you expect? But no, it's very nice. No, even on the sidewalk now, on the, going through customs, going through, security lines at the airport, people recognize me more and more, which is very nice, very nice. And then I get these wonderful stories of, affecting people's lives in a positive way, hopefully. And, that keeps me motivated to keep doing what I'm doing. Because most of the time I'm just, sitting in front of a screen typing away and don't have I don't have a good kind of gut feeling as to, what kind of impact I'm having. It's all theoretical until someone comes up to me and starts crying and talk about how, their uncle doesn't have to have their legs amputated. And, it's good stuff.
And it truly is cascading, because after reading How Not to Diet initially, and I was posting my results on social, and then I had tons of people coming to me crying and say, oh my God, you changed my life. Since I saw that, I did this. And so you don't even hear the cascading viral side, because they might not associate it with you because they didn't necessarily read it. So it's absolutely amazing. So for those listening who might not know, how and why did this guy change so many lives? Can you talk about how not to die, how not to diet, how not to age? What is it that you say you do that all these people are saying, wow, you've really changed my life?
Well, for me, it all started with my grandmother. I was just a kid and my grandma was sent home in a wheelchair essentially to die. She had end-stage heart disease. Already had so many bypass surgeries, basically ran out of plumbing at some point. Confined to a wheelchair, crushing chest pain. Her life was over at age 65. But then she heard about this guy, Nathan Pritikin, one of our early lifestyle medicine pioneers. And what happened next is actually detailed in Pritikin's biography. It talks about Frances Greger, my grandmother. They wheeled her in, and she walked out. Though she was given a medical death sentence at age 65, thanks to a healthy diet, was able to enjoy another 31 years on this planet until age 96 to continue to enjoy her 6 grandkids, including me. So that's why I went into medicine, why I practiced lifestyle medicine, why I started nutritionfacts.org, why I wrote the book, How Not to Die, why all the proceeds from all my books are all donated directly to charity. I just want to do for everyone's family what Pritikin did for my family.
And on that, I would really appreciate to hear from you kind of the direction of before you went into medicine and started learning enough to say, hey, I need to put this up on nutritionfacts.org and share this with people. Did you have a sense for what the answers would be? Because one of the things I've noticed reading How Not to Age versus How Not to Die, there are a lot of commonalities, but you're learning new things. Like you talk about, hey, I didn't know about spermidine, but in researching this, I now learned it, and now I am adding wheat germ and all this. And so what was your life before you started going down that path and researching? Because I think about my father, for example, who was a cardiologist and was overweight and started going on a diet and lost 65 pounds in a year, started running half marathons. And he said, I just had to unlearn everything they taught me in med school about nutrition, which, by the way, is like a 2-hour session of your 4 years of med school, which is bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my God. I learn as much writing these books as people get reading these books. Why? Because there's very little nutrition training in the entire medical training process. And so it's funny when people see an MD after people's name, that is basically an advertisement to the world that they know nothing about nutrition, that they have basically received no formal training in nutrition. And yet, people, when you ask in surveys, people really seek nutrition advice from their physicians over, for example, dietitians and people who've actually studied.
Right.
And so, I had to basically, I had that family experience. So I already seen it in my own eyes, but it wasn't really until 1990 with the publication of Dr. Dean Ornish's Lifestyle Heart Trial where it was finally put to the test in a randomized controlled trial, showing that the progression of heart disease could be reversed, arteries opened up without drugs, without surgery, just this plant-based diet and lifestyle program, proven with quantitative angiography, and then subsequent, data showing this dramatic improvement in blood flow to the heart muscle itself using, nuclear imaging. But here it was in black and white, published in some of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. Yet, basically, nothing happened. It was just like crickets. And even today, decades later, hundreds of thousands of Americans continue to die from this preventable, potentially reversible condition. And it's like, well, wait a second. If the cure to our number one killer could get lost down some rabbit hole and ignored, what else might there be in the medical literature that could help my patients, but just didn't have a corporate budget driving its promotion? So that's really what started me down this path to start learning. And it's all there in the literature. I mean, it was all about, going into the dusty basement stacks originally at Countway, which is the, Harvard's medical library in Boston. But now, of course, everything's online, which is now I can read it all in my jammies, which is much better.
Probably better for your lungs, not breathing in all the
Oh my
dust.
God, it's nasty. Yeah, God knows.
Yeah.
I do love that smell, though. There's something
Yeah.
about old library smell that gets me going.
Agreed. And so, as you're learning and you're researching and you're writing new books, you're changing what you're doing. And so I think back to the Daily Dozen, right? That you put on nutritionfacts.org and from How Not to Die and all that. What does your nutrition day to day or week to week look like now? Especially any changes based on what you've since learned.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, every time I, write a new book, get more information, I'm tweaking things as they go along. So like, this book, for example, I found out days I added papali, which is this long pepper, spice. I started eating more strawberries, which I just never really did before because of the fisetin, this kind of potential, senolytic compound, wheat germ for the spermidine, the cardamom.
AMLA comes up a few times.
AMLA?
That's one
Oh,
I've
yeah. Well, that
recently
was,
added.
I think AMLA was the original from Not to Die.
Okay.
I've been doing that for a long time.
Okay.
I'm eating more tempeh now, started growing my own mushrooms for the ergothioneine and the spermidine. And so, the basics, not much has really affected the basics, but I'm always, tweaking and adding new things. I mean, just as I learn more, I'm trying to think, there's some things that have certainly been removed. Oh my God. Erythritol, for example, appeared to be this kind of harmless, low calorie sweetener. And it turns out it's only harmless because we hadn't tested it sufficiently. And once we did, we found out it may be causing cardiovascular disease. So that's something I obviously stopped and tried to shout from the rooftops to get people to stop doing it, and felt this tremendous burden that I had led people astray. But yeah, so it goes in both directions, and and that's why it's just critically important that I make sure that everything I put out there is fact checked. We have our own fact checker on board. Now I have 20 staff, so we have this whole kind of research army that's make sure that anytime some new study comes out, we can really put it in context of everything else that's been published on the subject in the past, so we don't get led astray by some kind of tangential new data point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On the book as well, especially How Not to Age, it's not just what you're consuming and putting in your body or what you're not consuming. Actually, before I move on, I do have a very selfish question. So since reading How Not to Die, it's whole food, plant, not plant-based, right? Because to your point, Oreos are plant, like they're vegan. That's not helping you. But like eating whole foods is really where it's at, and getting the right whole foods to get that balance. But I have this guilty pleasure that I love Celsius, like especially when I swim in the ocean. Celsius, it's these drinks.
I didn't know.
They have taurine, they have all this stuff, but they use artificial sweeteners.
Okay.
And what I can't tell, they're ones you can get with stevia, but they're harder. I use the packets. I have to see which sweetener they use on those. But how harmful, even if it was just on the gut microbiome, because I'll do fasting. And then as soon as I come back and I put that in, my body's like, oh my God, this is awful. Like,
what do you mean? You don't need me to tell you. Your own body's telling you. Come on.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
No. I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, more and more we're learning. I mean, they get narrower and narrower in terms of some of these low calorie and artificial sweeteners. In terms of negative effects, metabolic effects, microbiome effects. I mean, these companies used to, brag that, for example, sucralose, Splenda, does not get absorbed into the system. And therefore it's safe, right? They're arguing it's safe. Well, yeah, you know what that means? That means that it goes down to your colon, can affect your microbiome. And that's where we think some of these negative metabolic effects are coming from. And it's like, well, I mean, I don't know what you like about the Celsius, but you could get taurine. You could get, maybe you
can
get
the taste. It's all for the taste. It's just delicious.
They don't sell like So it's a matter of seeing if you can replicate that taste in some other way that just didn't have the downside.
Because they also have caffeine. I don't even want the caffeine. I do decaf coffee. So I'm getting a bunch of things, the artificial sweetener caffeine. I don't want to get this taste. So
wow. Now I want to try it.
I mean, they are delicious.
Oh, Jesus, really? Okay.
It's so good.
Good to know.
Also, now that I just said it, because I would love to ask you on fasting. So the fasting was another thing that came up, right? We see it in rodent studies and all this and calorie restriction. But as Peter Attia had said, it's one of these things we know is good for you, but we don't know the dosing or the frequency to take of it. And so I was doing 5-day fasts. And like, how much better is that than a 3-day fast? Like, what I see is after 1 or 2 days, my sleep is phenomenal. My is phenomenal. My recovery is great. By day 4 or 5, I can't sleep. I'm so excited. Energy levels are sure. No, the trade-offs there. Have you looked much at the fasting side of nutritional health?
Yeah, well, so that's the largest chapter in my book, How Not to Diet, was on fast. It was on intermittent fasting, talking about I go through, water only fasting and alternate day fasting and 5-2 and 25-5 and fasting mimicking diets and on through the list. And I think, the bottom line is really, I think early time restricted feeding. I talk about the pros and cons of each, but that's, I think, really where most of the money is. And so that's basically restricting one's daily feeding window to 12 hours or less. And most importantly, it should be earlier rather than later. If anything, we skip supper, not breakfast. We should try to stuff as many calories earlier into the day as possible. The exact same food eaten in the morning, it causes less accumulation of body fat. The exact same food, exact same calories eaten in the evening, less of a blood sugar spike, less triglycerides. If you're going to eat junk, eat it in the morning. Have that Celsius in the morning. Early time restricted feeding is basically the take home from the fasting chapter.
Well, but the autophagy side as well. Yeah. So I get, and that's enough time.
No. In fact, only in rodents is enough time, right? No, but it really takes 2 to 3 days for autophagy to start ramping up in human beings. Thankfully, there's lots of other ways we can boost autophagy without going that long. So that's where the spermidine comes in, the chlorogenic acid from your decaf coffee, and diminishing acrylamide and aerobic exercise, and there's lots of ways we can boost autophagy without dealing with the downsides of fasting.
And so on the exercise front, based on what you've learned in the research you do, what is your own exercise and fitness routine on a kind of week-to-week basis?
Well, I have the one that I recommend. Unfortunately, I find it difficult to find ways to be active and productive at the same time. So right now I'm standing on a treadmill. I have it off just because I don't want to make people nauseous. But so I work on a walking treadmill. So I end up, walking about 14 miles a day. But unfortunately, I don't get my heart rate up. Not working on flexibility, not doing resistance training. And so there's lots of things that, I go through and how not to age, all the recommendations and really what we should target for. But unfortunately, I find myself too busy to take my own advice.
Okay, yeah. So, what you're doing tons of zone 2 with the 14-mile walking. And I guess what you were saying you would, it's so low heart rate. So maybe not even all the way elevated.
No. Yeah, I'm not getting my heart rate up. It's not really exercise. It's just not being sedentary.
It's just, the movement.
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah. And so it's really just like, I don't have that prolonged sitting. Which is so detrimental. Smoking. So I'm keeping blood flow, my lower extremities going, but really, not doing, really not, stressing my body like I should.
You're stressing whether it's the strength training or kind of the more HIIT oriented.
Oh yeah.
High rate.
Yeah.
Well, and then back to, there are a lot of things you're trying to do and you're very productive and put out on the sleep side. So in the book, you talk about the U-shaped curve.
You're talking about my two worst. Yeah.
I guess let's talk about those two, what you recommend and then what you actually do.
Right. So, the sleep is really interesting. That's one of the most kind of surprising things I found in How Not to Age. But yeah, the target should be 7 to 8 hours a night, and there's all sorts of, healthy ways to do that and unhealthy ways to do that. And, happy to talk about any of them.
Knowing there's so much you want to get done. And I'm not sure if you hit that 78 window, but if you're trying to maximize, hey, I understand it's my brain's cleansing time and I need it to flush the toxin, et cetera. Are there things that you either take or routines that you follow or temperature of the room or bed that you do to try to make the most of whatever time you get?
Yeah, sure. Right. No. Optimal sleep hygiene and conditioning, cool and quiet and dark and go on through the list. And And so I have the 4 rules of each, I talk about it. And, then there's all sorts of other things you can do, warm showers, foot and body baths before bedtime, warm socks at night have been shown to help with sleep. We want to stay away from, these hypnotics like, sleeping pills like Ambien, surprisingly ineffective and associated with significant higher risk of premature death. Melatonin supplements not recommended due to contamination concerns, but there are melatonin-rich foods, such as kiwi fruit, tart cherries, that have been shown to help, at least compared to control.
Yeah, I started tart cherry because of a podcast guest. She was like, I used to do dark chocolate, which is the caffeine and everything before bed, but now it's my treat. I switched to this tart cherry juice. I'm like, oh, fantastic. So that's what I do now with my magnesium at night. It's great.
Oh, perfect. Okay. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing you brought up in How Not to Age, the Ambien, right? People are like, oh, I'm sleeping great, until we could start tracking it.
Oh, isn't that amazing? Yeah, no. So, right, you ask people, you say, so Ambien not been found effective for sleep, and people are like, that's bullshit. Or maybe it doesn't work for the average person, but it certainly works for me. I sleep so much better. But it turns out it's an amnesiac. So you actually didn't sleep well, but you forgot how bad you sleep, and you wake up, you'd be like, wow, I slept great. And all it is the drug faking it. But you actually put people in a sleep study where you hook people up and you actually don't get better sleep. You just forgot how bad and increase your risk of all-cause mortality. I would stay away from these drugs.
And do you use anything to track your own sleep?
I don't.
Okay.
Other than just kind of total sleep time. But no, I don't. I know there's all sorts of cool gizmos now that you can, you strap to yourself.
No, on like stress management mindset, I think there was an interesting one you talked about in Nazi occupation. Those on a plant-based diet were less impacted. It's like stress impacted you differently if you were on a plant-based diet than if you were consuming animal protein.
Everybody was on a plant-based diet. So what happened during, so both in World War I and World War II, what happened during rationing? What happened when supplies are cut off. So, for example, in Nazi-occupied Europe, they took all the livestock. People were living off of feed crops, so they were living off of the barley that you normally feed to the animals. People were living off of kind of backyard garden vegetables for years. And you think, well, what happened? What an interesting natural experiment. What happens to the disease rates? Now, you would assume if stress played a critical role in heart disease, for example, then what possible situation would be more stressful than being under Nazi occupation? And so you would assume, oh my God, heart disease rates must have skyrocketed. What happened? Absolutely the opposite. Plummeted. Heart disease rates absolutely plummeted. Why? Because diet trumps stress. Because all of a sudden they weren't eating these rich diets. They didn't have the butter. They didn't have all the, the saturated fat intake. They also didn't have sugar. Sometimes there was tobacco rationing. All sorts of things went into, but it's just kind of an interesting experiment that really gives you a sense of, even under stressful conditions, the reason why stress, as well as social isolation, loneliness, bereavement, why that's tied to negative health outcomes, which it absolutely is because when people are stressed, they not only tend to eat more, but they tend to eat worse foods, high in sugar, fat, calories. People who are stressed often tend to use more substances such as alcohol, tobacco, illicit drugs. So increased stress is associated with lifestyle behaviors that increase mortality, but stress itself or socialization itself does not appear to independently shorten lifespan. So that's good news. So you can be stressed and lonely as long as that doesn't lead you to eating really crappy, you're not exercising, you're not taking good care of yourself, you should be able to kind of maintain your health during those circumstances.
And it was similar with meditation. I think you cited that more meditation or more frequent wasn't associated with lower cardiovascular issues.
Well, it's really tough. These are impossible studies to do, right? So of course you can't blind people. Now, long-term meditators do have really good public health statistics compared to a kind of a regular control group. But of course, the question is, what is the confounding? There's the self-selection. There's people, long-term meditators tend to eat healthier, tend not to smoke, all these other things. And so all we really have are these kind of short-term experiments where if you randomize people to meditation or not, you don't see benefits, but that's just a few weeks, right? And meditators will be like, well, yeah, I mean, the reason why people with thousands of hours of meditation training have better public health statistics is because they've been meditating for thousands of hours, and you're not going to replicate that with a few weeks of meditation. So what we can say is that short term, a few weeks doesn't seem to move the needle. And we do have that long-term kind of observational data. We don't know if it's cause and effect. It's very similar to, what with diet. It'd be nice to randomize people to different diets for decades, but unfortunately we don't have that. So what we have, these short-term studies where we can measure intermediate outcomes, like what does it do to your cholesterol and blood sugar and blood pressure? Using those intermediate risk factors, we can kind of get a sense of, okay, that explains why, you put people on this diet, their cholesterol goes down, and people who happen to be on this diet for many decades have lower rates of heart disease, which is associated. And so you'd be like, okay, all the evidence kind of matches. And so it'd be like, okay, this makes sense to follow this kind of diet. Same thing with smoking cessation. There's not a single study on the planet showing that smoking cessation causes people to live longer. Why? Because smoking cessation doesn't work. You tell people to stop smoking, and they just don't do it. So you can randomize people to stop smoking or not, but guess what? It doesn't work because they don't stop smoking. And so you don't get enough of a differential, and they actually live the same. So we're not actually comparing non-smokers to smokers.
Right.
We're comparing people. So it's like with diet. You tell people, eat this way. We randomize you to eat this way, but you can't do that for 5 years because people don't do it. And so there's these famous, huge, massive trials where they randomize people to, for example, a low-fat diet and saw no benefits. But you always have to ask, if you don't see the effects that you would expect, you have to be, well, did they actually do it? Did they actually comply? And in which case, if they didn't, well, then it doesn't tell you anything other than it's very hard to get people to change their lifestyle.
On changing the lifestyle, this is one I go back and forth on. I'd love your thoughts because there's a whole camp on more and more protein. You need protein. A lot of research you've pointed to is no, right? Like it's actually way lower than we think. And so I was topping up my diet with egg whites, right? I'd make my salads, I'd do my vegetables, and I'd put egg whites in. And then at that same TED talk, much less in your books, you showed data that like eggs were associated with worse outcomes than even meat. And my question was, hey, is it the whole egg if you just did the whites versus?
Yeah, no, it's probably the yolk. It's probably, okay. I mean, so that's where the cholesterol is, the choline for the TMAO production. So yeah, we would not expect those outcomes associated with egg consumption to be associated with just the egg white. So when we say that egg protein consumption is associated with just measuring how much protein they're getting from eggs, but guess what comes with egg protein? The cholesterol in the yolk that most people aren't eating, white, egg white omelets. They're eating the whole egg. And so that's why. And so, I mean, that's what we would presume to be the case. For example, you can feed people egg whites. You don't see it affecting their cholesterol. Of course, you feed people egg yolks and you do see a problem.
Yeah. May I ask, this is whether it's you talked about going back to the Dusty Library, and we have these studies. We have this research going way back on these are things we know. And I think it was How Not to Diet, where you said they came up with the recommendation on how much meat to eat. And you're like, but there's no data saying that that's what we should do. And like, yeah, but if we told them the real number, which is 0, no one would follow it. So we had to kind of come up with this random number out of nowhere. And you have this other camp, whether it's a carnivore or the omnivore or the paleo, pushing the other side saying, well, here's the problem with the methodology, right? It's observational. It's just, here's all the problem. My question back to you is, has there ever been a study in the history showing the opposite? They're like, okay, great. You're calling all the problems for the studies that show whole food plant-based is better than the alternative. Has there ever been a study, methodology or not, that shows eating meat is better than the alternative?
Oh, a methodology. Well, methodology independent, absolutely. So you can show, so for example, the PURE study, this large multi-country epidemiological study found that those people, eating more, protein, more carbs and less protein did better. More carbs, less protein did worse than those the other. And you think, well, that seems counterintuitive. Of course, why? Because they're looking at Bangladesh, and Bangladesh, the only people that there was extreme poverty, and they literally couldn't afford any protein, and they were eating white rice. And they had no access to healthcare. Of course, they had these horrible public health statistics. They're some of the poorest people on planet Earth.
So they're not even getting a variety of plants, right? They're not even getting nutrients from the plants.
And so it was really just a proxy. So their high carb intake and low meat intake is really just a proxy for extreme poverty. And of course, in those conditions, you can't do it with confounders. But in terms of a randomized controlled trial that actually showed that more meat was better. I mean, I do. So there are studies funded by the Beef Council and the egg industry, and that show benefits. And so I talk about those studies, exactly how they do that. So for example, these beef studies showing that you can add beef to people's diet and their cholesterol goes down. Amazing. How do you do that? What you do is you add beef to the diet, but so decrease the amount of other meat, eggs, and dairy such that their saturated fat intake actually goes down. Their cholesterol intake actually goes down. And what happens? It goes down. I mean, so it's like you could add Twinkies to someone's diet and just cut more than a Twinkie's worth of sugar out of their diet. So, okay, now they can't drink Coke and they can't, and so they're actually getting less sugar overall and say, look, we just added Twinkies to people's diet. And their triglycerides are better, their liver fat. Oh my God, it's amazing. And so, I mean, there's all sorts of studies, but you look at the conflicts of interest statement, you realize, oh, well, obviously. Now, just because something's funded by the industry doesn't mean necessarily it's a bad study, but you just have to use the extra grain of salt and look at the materials and methods and be like, has this study been intentionally designed to bring about a predetermined outcome?
And with the decades of good studies showing the alternative, there are still physicians, there's still people in the space that care about their health, investing in their health, that really come out with, no, like there's nothing on this plant-based. You need plants, you need animals, all this. I don't know, is the story just, I want to eat animals so badly that like, I want this to be true, so I'm going to create a story. Like, what is the motivating factor there?
So, you send them to the True Health Initiative, truehealthinitiative.org. There's started by Dr. David Katz, the head of the Yale Prevention Research Center, saw all this crazy nuttiness online. It was like, oh my God, people think it's so controversial, but there's actually a consensus in the nutrition world as the core tenets of healthy eating and living. And so it basically formed the IPCC of nutrition. You want to know about climate? You ask the climate scientists. You want to know about nutrition? You ask the nutrition scientists. Brought together hundreds top nutrition scientists in the world to agree to a consensus statement as to what is the healthiest human diet. Spoiler alert, it's a diet centered around whole plant foods. But it's just like, look, there is a consensus. And if you disagree with the consensus, you have to have this extraordinary evidence to be like, you're right and all of science is wrong. Okay. Look, that's how science changes. Whip it out. Let me see it. And they just don't have the science. Now they can bring out theory. That's great. But when put to the test, and we're talking about life and death decisions, what we eat, number one cause of death and disability in the United States, is our diet. Bumping tobacco smoking to, tobacco is number 2, kills about 500,000 Americans every year. Our diet kills many more. So when it comes to something as life and death as to what to feed ourselves and our families, then we should base those decisions on the best available balance of evidence until proven otherwise.
And I know we're bumping on time. If I could ask one last question, reading your books, talking to you, the puns, everything, humor seems to play a big role in your life. Like where does that come from? And what do you think that gives you?
It's just, you got to get people, you just can't look, the book had like 13,000 citations. It's like, and you gotta make it entertaining. People are going to look at it anymore. It doesn't matter with the science anymore. It's like, can you get some eyeballs? And so, adding some humor, some entertainment value gets people to kind of take the medicine. Unfortunately, otherwise, it'd be nice if just the data, everyone was data driven, just show me the science and then boom, but it's like, unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. And if you can be entertaining enough, you can get people to believe the earth is flat.
Dr. Greger, thank you so much. For anyone listening to this, it is entertaining. The book initially came to my life because someone said, you need to read this. It will change your life. It did. And I've since given it and told many others the same. Please check him out. He has many amazing books that will indeed change your life for the better. Thank you so much for the time today, Dr. Greger. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Home of Healthspan podcast. And remember, you can always find the products, practices, and routines mentioned by today's guests, as well as many other Healthspan role models on alively.com. Enjoy a lively day.